Hey guys, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of an armchair expert on China, what it is, and how it could be harmful to you, to your business, even to your government in terms of getting the correct and comprehensive understanding of China and its people in order to make the best decisions moving forward in terms of public policy, in terms of business decisions, or even if you're planning a trip to China to visit or to work. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, what originally got me thinking about the idea of armchair experts was a tweet I saw several days ago by Mr. Orville Schell, who said something very strange in relation to the recent spate of floods we've seen in China. He said that the floods are dangerous, not just because they lead to loss of life, but because it could be seen as, a violation of the mandate of heaven, which, for those of you who don't know, the mandate of heaven was something that was used hundreds of years ago to discuss imperial emperors and dynasties, and in that if there was a disaster or a calamity, it could signal that heaven was displeased with the ruling emperor. And this is something that, again, in history, in the past, could lead to rebellions, it could lead to revolts and general unhappiness. It was very strange to see someone saying that the mandate of heaven was actually going to be discussed or talked about by modern Chinese today in relation to a flood. What was a little stranger was that looking at who sent this tweet, Mr. Orville Schell, is not some random nobody. He's not someone who just took a history class on China or is interested in talking about Chinese history, which I like to do as well. What he is a director at the Center for U.S China Relations at the Asia Society, which is a nonprofit focused on improving relations between Chinese people, people overseas, between businesses and the such. So it was very strange, not just that he had a very bad take on China and the floods, but also that he is in such a prominent position while having apparently no understanding or experience with the modern China or the Chinese people. Now, I will grant it that he did study abroad, studying the Chinese language in the early 70s. Again, that's more than about 50 years ago. And he wasn't even in mainland China. He did it in Taiwan at the time. I think at the time they probably couldn't study very easily in China because it's not started opening up yet. But still, he, according to his Wikipedia profile, he has no clear work records or study records or travel records that I've seen anywhere in actual China, mainland China as we'll call it. So that's why it seemed very strange and very concerning, to be honest. And that really gets further into why armchair experts are a problem. It's not because they have ideas about China or they have discussions about China or commentary. That's welcome, even if people are off base, because there's people online that will tell them they're off base. The issue is that we have someone who apparently doesn't know the China or the Chinese people, who is in a prominent position of advising businesses and potentially governments. That's where it's a problem, especially in the current climate where we have the U.S. thinking it's in a Cold War with China. We have more and more diplomatic spats going on. From my point of view, again, having spent my entire adult career almost in China, working with Chinese companies, helping bridge the gap between China and overseas markets, I think it's a big problem if we have experts who haven't actually experienced China or the Chinese people. That's what I consider a problem, and that's why I dubbed them armchair experts, because they don't actually come to China. They don't actually engage with the real Chinese people. They don't actually see what us on the ground here see about China or the Chinese people. But still, they are in prominent positions overseas. Maybe they do research. Maybe they do journalism, which is good. But from overseas, without experiencing the actual situation. That's what I find to be a problem, which is why I've dubbed them armchair experts. So, moving forward, let's talk a little bit more about some of the key reasons why they may be a big problem. All right, so reason number one, if it's too easy, then anyone can do it. One of the things we've seen is we see a lot of people writing books about China, about their experience in China. Sometimes they've just stayed here for 6 months or a few years, and then they write a book, basically telling the world this is China. Sometimes they don't even visit China. Sometimes they do research. They talk to people overseas, or they just write something. And this is something that we've seen, I think, in one of the U.S. government administration's current top China advisors, that I believe Peter Navarro. And he apparently has written a very critical book about China, and apparently he's even made up sources for this book, though that is more of an extreme example. But the key thing is that if we're actually wanting to have real experts to advise us on China, I mean, it can't just be someone who wrote a book or is able to just easily write a book, because, again, anyone can do it. We're looking for people who have hard to replicate experience, people who have spent their lives, a large portion of their lives, invested in this thing, experience it face to face, being hand in hand with China, so they can actually tell us what the real China is, especially because China has been changing very fast. Since it opened up in the late 70s until now, the company has transformed, literally transformed, in terms of industry, in terms of the people, society, technology. And having someone who hasn't been here, I mean, they don't know, they don't understand. What you read in the news about China is miles away from actually deeply comprehending what actually is happening on the ground with the Chinese people. All right, so reason number 2, scholars, whether it be people who are scholars of Chinese history, which again I'm a fan of, or people who are simply writing research and journal articles, which again, guilty, I've done a journal article myself. But my criticism is mainly for the people who simply do this from overseas, who are not actually talking to real Chinese people, or maybe they're relying on secondhand sources. And again, I'm fine with people writing articles and journal articles about China, Chinese history, Chinese society, but it's an issue when people who have only been writing from a scholarly point of view, from a historical point of view, who are then deemed as these key experts who can advise us about how do we work with and deal with China into the future. I remember some of the comments I actually saw defending the original tweet by talking about historical issues and more kind of scholarly issues, and maybe not entirely relevant, but it did bring to mind something one of my old economy teachers said to me. It's about models. When you're talking about specifically economic models like supply and demand, but still models are never right. They're always wrong. But they allow us to understand how something works, to move closer to a greater understanding of what the actual truth is, even if the model is incapable of representing it. And that kind of relates to things like, going back to the original tweet, to the Tianming, to the Mandate of Heaven. I think it's very relevant in terms of understanding the development of Chinese history of society. It's certainly an important point, but just because a thing exists, just because you can use it to understand China as a whole, its thousands of years of history, doesn't mean it is 100% accurate to, say, use it in the present. So there is a difference between looking at historical knowledge, looking at models, versus understanding what the real China is. So, reason number 3. I already covered this to an extent already, but I do have a serious issue with people who, again, who are in prominent positions, advising businesses and governments on dealing with China, who have not really spent any time in China. Maybe and visiting on a mission or a trip doesn't count. I'm asking why people who are in these positions have never actually spent significant amounts of time in China, talking with the Chinese government, talking with the Chinese businesses, Chinese people, and having these conversations is, extremely important. the views that the Chinese people have, whether they are regular people, the old 100 names, Lao Baixing as we say, whether they are Chinese business leaders, whether they are the Chinese government members. If you are unable to have those direct conversations with them, you aren't able to understand what they're thinking, which is often very nuanced and often very different from the ways in which people overseas might think. All right, reason number 4, and this is a key thing. It combines with being in China to a certain extent, but it's more focused on having an understanding of the Chinese language and of Chinese culture. And there's been a lot of debates on social media about this point, whether someone can be an expert on China or really effectively work in China if they don't know and speak the Chinese language as well as know the cultural customs and society. And I come down on the side of you can't really be an expert, especially an expert that advises governments and businesses, if you do not have that experience of speaking Chinese, speaking the Chinese language, knowing the culture. I mean, if you want to be a trusted and effective expert, just because it's like an onion, layers of the onion. You have to keep going deeper, and you can't go deeper unless you are able to speak the language and speak to the people in the language they understand. There's complete layers that are lost if you do not have that understanding. The same would be as how effective would a Chinese person be with no English knowledge whatsoever, but they were trying to advise on the U.S. government action simply by looking at translations or transcriptions of articles or speeches said in English. I wouldn't think they'd be very effective, to be honest. Lastly, this kind of relates to another term we see on social media about China in regards to, it's called the China watchers, people who are watching China from afar. And I think it kind of relates to this idiom we have in Chinese where it's basically saying the person watching a game of chess, for example, from the sidelines, is able to see more clearly than the person actually in the game. And this immediately kind of conjures up images of kind of, the crowds of old men you will see playing Chinese Go or Chinese chess on the side of the road, and there'll be a lot of people clustered around and watching. And I think this is a little bit off the mark, this idea, mainly because the thing with, if you're watching a game of Chinese chess, to use the idiom, you can only be more clear than the person playing if you understand the rules and the context of the game. People who are watching China from overseas, if they don't know the culture, they don't know the language, if they haven't actually been there and understand how modern Chinese society works, how can they have a clear vision, an unjaded and unbiased opinion, simply by watching? So I think that's an interesting point to bring up too, just because you see so many people claim to be China watchers nowadays. And to many of us who actually work in China, there's a big negative connotation to that, which I'll probably get into more in a future video. But that's point number 5. Just because you're watching on the sidelines doesn't mean you can see more clearly. In somewhat of a bonus point on why being an armchair expert is bad, I'll say they're not Chinese. And this is partly true, I would say, because I completely agree that people who are not Chinese, not native Chinese, didn't grow up in China, can be advisors on working with the Chinese government, Chinese businesses, the Chinese people. However, maybe even as someone who has spent my entire career working with Chinese companies, maybe it would be good to have some of those really senior experts with government, with policy, with businesses, being Chinese. We see a lot of people that are white, that are Westerners, and it would really be good to see more people who have actually grown up in China advising the West on the actual situation in China. Again, totally happy with seeing people like me who have spent their entire lives or their entire career studying this and interacting with China and the Chinese people. But at the same time, maybe look for a Chinese person first. And maybe that's going to hurt my future career chances. But still, definitely consider actual real Chinese people as being the people who can most accurately tell you about what it's like in China and to serve as a bridge in many cases. All right, so in closing, I'd just like to reemphasize that I am not calling for people not being allowed to speak about China, to talk about China, to have very vastly differing views on China. Nobody can change that. And I very much encourage people to learn, to study, to ask questions, to comment about what they know or what they think they know. However, as tensions rapidly escalate between China and the U.S., as China becomes a much more important part of the world economy, of the world geopolitical scene, I personally feel that it is vital that the people we choose to represent us and to act on our behalf as experts advising government, policymakers, businesses, these people need to have the right experience. They need to have actual experience in China or working with Chinese people or even be Chinese people. Because if we're going to, as a country, as a society, as the West, you might say, if we're going to be able to move forward working with China and having good relations with China, we need people who actually know what's going on, who are not just looking into historical textbooks and dropping words, names like the Mandate of Heaven. We need people who can understand from an on-the-ground perspective what's happening in China, what are the Chinese people thinking, what's the government thinking, and why. And therefore, after we know that, after we have those people, we can much more effectively decide how do we move forward, how do we deal with whatever's happening with China right now, whether it's good, whether it's bad. Because otherwise, if we don't even know the rules of the game, to use the previous chess metaphor I was talking about, how can we move forward? All right, that's it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to let me know what you think about the idea of an armchair expert, especially relating to China, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at SeanUM_China, and I'd be very happy to talk more, even if you have an opposing view. I'd also very much appreciate it if you could subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as subscribe to my blog, thechinaculturecorner.com. And with the blog, you'll be able to receive updates not just for new articles, but also for new videos from my YouTube channel as well. So again, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.